The agenda this week learned how cell phones can become cyber weapons, heard about the joys and challenges of being Black and queer, assessed racism in the wellness industry. The agenda's week in review begins with the economic factors contributing to populism.
The original title of our book was Defeating Populism when we first started thinking about it. But it became very clear as we maybe perhaps started to empathize and sympathize with the populist complaint around economic unfairness. Again, that Americans live over a trapdoor that can be sprung by a number of different things that we kind of take for granted that you're going to be taken care of in Canada. We changed the title with the advice of our editor in the UK with Polity Books of Reclaiming Populism. And remember that the underlying thesis of the book is how to win back disenchanted voters, how to give mainstream politicians the language and the tools to bring back people who feel marginalized, who feel that there's a clique, as Armin says, that basically write the rules for them that they have no part and they don't benefit from. So what we're arguing, particularly in chapters 4 and 5, is there's a number of very powerful tools that mainstream politicians can use if they take the claims of populist voters, disenchanted voters seriously, that you can reclaim the populist vote and bring it back to create a more inclusive, pluralist, pro-democratic country.
Understood. Miles, in some respects, I hate to bring the convoy back into this thing because there are so many different agendas going on in different locations that it's hard to know. But let's just say, I mean, surely Irene is correct. Part of this is, don't tell me what to do with my body. I'll on the whole vaccine issue. But part of it surely is there are a number of people who feel as if the economy has moved right along and right past them, and that the social mobility that they once thought was part of the Canadian dream is no longer there. That's certainly some people's agenda in the convoy. We've heard it. We've heard it from a number of people who've lost their jobs and who think that the Canadian dream is not part of their particular reality anymore. And I guess the question is, if they're right, what went wrong?
If they're right, what went wrong? To some degree, they are right. Statistics Canada, for example, has shown that somewhere around 50% of children are doing better than their parents. If they're right, what went wrong? Two things. One, as Paul alluded to, it's the nature of growth. What happened is, as we grabbed onto this globalism agenda, this neoliberal agenda in the 80s and 90s, opening up the economy, an economy that was hit with major changes in the way we work with the power of computing. What went wrong is some people had to compete head on with the computer. If you do routine jobs, like think of your stereotypical factory worker who would have a piece of machinery move across him and he would weld a joint. Well, robots do that now. Think of middle managers whose major job was to process information, to move it from the shop floor to upper management. Well, Excel spreadsheets can do that now. So people who were doing routine jobs went head to head in competition with the computer, and they lost out. They lost out in status, and that impacted their identity as well. One of the things that I would pair with this book is a recent book by Michael Sandel called The Tyranny of Merit.
Oh, we had him on this program talking about that book. It's a great one.
That's right. And so what he also points out, as Paul has just said, the thing about inequality, it engenders entitlement amongst those at the top. It fosters shame amongst those at the bottom, and it creates insecurity for everybody in the middle. So this gets wrapped up with identity as well. And this is where I sort of disagree with Paul. If you just sort of move into a prescription of more social mobility, it depends upon how identity politics gets layered onto that. You talked about that famous quote of Hillary Clinton's. What went wrong is we didn't value the work that people now do in any way. We didn't recognize their dignity. What could be worse for a lot of males who did work that was more routine, whose identity was wrapped up with being a provider, than to have a highly educated urban woman tell them that they're deplorable. And so then that opens up a whole different identity politics. Two things went wrong. We didn't pay enough attention to people who can't get an education. We kept telling them, get more education. And if they can't, then they're perceived as losers. So it was the economy mixing up with a type of rhetoric that engendered entitlement, created shame, fostered insecurity.
What we need to be doing is talking about how we make every job a good job in an era of population aging. Populism in an era of population aging could be leading to making more jobs better jobs, could be leading to making the best benefits are portable benefits. As we've learned with our healthcare system, we've got a real issue on understanding how the social infrastructure we offer one another becomes the platform on which we build a more inclusive economy where more people are benefiting from growth because they're getting something back from it. They're not just contributing to higher productivity and more profits. They're actually seeing quality of life improving, whether it's through wages or through services that they can access, high quality service they can access at low cost. For example, early learning and childcare, which is a huge breakthrough, but the first one in a generation, 2 generations.
When you hack into a device using Pegasus, which is probably the most sophisticated mercenary spyware technology in the world today, first of all, it leaves no trace. This particular version of Pegasus involved no interaction on the part of the target. They simply commandeered the device silently, so the target wouldn't be aware that there's somebody else, a spy in their pocket, if you will. Once you're inside that device, you can do virtually anything and more, really, than a user can do. So that means you can read every email, every text message, even those that are end-to-end encrypted. You can turn on the camera. You can turn on the audio capture, effectively turning that device into a bug. You could also plant falsely incriminating information if you so desire. I'm not saying that happened in this case, but the prospect is certainly there. So there's a whole range of things that can be done. Speaking to the question you asked, one of the victims, a prominent senator who was leading the opposition in the 2019 elections and whose phone we determined was hacked multiple times with Pegasus, his confidential information was actually broadcast out of context over Polish state media to try to paint a picture of him that was unflattering and perhaps corrupt. So that speaks to what you're asking here. What are the possibilities? Well, you can certainly spy on someone, engage in espionage, but you can also gather information, taint it in various ways, leak it, broadcast it out of context to falsely incriminate somebody.
Well, you are painting a picture of something that I have seen described as the most powerful cyber weapon in the world. Do you agree with that characterization?
Yes, absolutely. That was an analysis done by Google's Project Zero team. This is like their high-tech threat intelligence team. They did a breakdown of Pegasus based on actually a disclosure that the Citizen Lab made. We captured Pegasus in the wild last year and disclosed it to Apple. Google Project Zero did a breakdown of it, and they said this is by far the most sophisticated piece of surveillance technology that they had ever seen.
Now, Pegasus is that sort of mythical horse with wings. Why do they call this thing Pegasus?
I don't know. That's some branding exercise by the company itself. I have no idea. All I can say is this is very powerful technology sold by a very lucrative company, makes a lot of money, a lot of revenue from this type of sale to government clients who, have a insatiable appetite. I mean, you can imagine, just think about how I describe this type of technology. If you put yourself in the position of a government security agency, how addictive that would be once you start, spying on someone, gathering information. You want to do more of it. And this surveillance technology is sold on a license basis. So how many victims do you want to hack? Well, it'll cost you X dollars.
Now, your Citizen Lab has initiated something called the Pegasus Project. What's that all about?
The Pegasus Project is a consortium of journalists and NGOs, especially Amnesty International, that came together to work on investigating abuses of Pegasus spyware. Actually, the Citizen Lab's role in that particular project is more of a supportive one. We did a peer review of some of their methodology and the forensic analysis that they did. So we're not behind it, if you will. Although I will say that the Citizen Lab actually did the very first public evidence-based report on NSO Group back in 2016. We really kicked off investigations into NSO Group and have done extensive reporting ever since.
We actually sought to understand that very dynamic, like what is the urban or city experience compared to the rural experience or the outer city experience. And we found that there aren't a lot of programs for Black LGBT youth, and maybe those programs that are in their local neighborhoods, they prefer not to access, because roughly 50% of the respondents in our community needs assessment shared that they commuted to Toronto for programming, like LGBTQ programming. And I think a lot of that has to do with safety, a lot of that has to do with options, as well as connections, the type of programs that's being run in the city. Unfortunately, most programs are in the downtown core. It's in, I don't even live in downtown Toronto, but it's in the downtown core. So for individuals who live outside the city, that does create an additional task, I guess, in terms of having to commute maybe an hour or 2 hours to get to a program. But yeah, I think there are like service deserts, depending on where you are in the country.
And Samantha, I wanted to ask you, you were talking about the workplace, and I imagine that experiences are very different for different generations. How do the challenges of young Black and queer folks differ from members of the community who might be older?
Yeah, so I think the issues for younger Black queer folks that I've encountered thus far are things like doxing. Folks that have access to our services, for instance, work in sex work, right? And so the issues may be different, but I think that they also are similar in the sense that the core issue or the crux of the issue also more often than not has to deal with harassment, discrimination, ableism, transphobia. And so while there may be different needs between generations, I think the crux of the issue remains the same. And so I'm fortunate to be able to support folks regardless of their age.
You know, one of the things that I love about social media is the fact that you can see content that otherwise you might never see before. Last week, I saw a video of these two older women who were finally getting married, and because they were, for most of their life, their relationship was a secret. Kamali, you know, are there issues older generations face that might be different from those of who are in the younger generation?
Absolutely. I think we should be concerned around LGBTQI plus persons of color who are getting older. You know, I came of age a generation after those who were primarily affected by the HIV epidemic, and though that population continues to do so. And we know that LGBTQI plus seniors face issues of isolation, homelessness, and we need to be concerned about ensuring that older LGBTQI plus persons are taken care of as well. And I also just want to go back to a comment you made to my colleague Tatiana around services in the LGBTQI plus community and downtown Toronto. I think we really have to point out, or at least I want to point out, that for many, Church Street is not a safe place for people of color. And it's not just because of services downtown, but it is because around racism that exists within the LGBTQI plus community. And so that needs to be pointed out, and the lack of access to services for people that makes them coming downtown is real. And what that means is, unfortunately, even though you know, it's great to see rainbow flags down in Church Street and the downtown core, what it also means is that people who do not feel safe getting access to services are sometimes living in communities that are not safe for them.
plays out around who profits, who benefits, who gets to call themselves a leader, an expert, a guru, and then this pushback around the calling in and the desire to recognize and decolonize practices that are often from cultures of origin or co-opted by people who aren't originally from that culture of origin, and this like fragility and defensiveness of, oh, but this really, I'm really good at this and it really serves me and it's really serving the community that I've created. So this tension around these beautiful practices that really do serve to individual and collective well-being, but who benefits from what leader, where do the profits flow, this sort of thing.
We're going to get into some of the things that you brought up. The wellness industry is a billion-dollar industry. Katie, what sectors fall under the wellness economy umbrella?
Yeah, well, I really believe in the 7 prongs of wellness. And so spiritual, physical, mental, intellectual, all of these sectors fall under that economy, including, I think I mentioned social and occupational. So anything that involves someone's well-being, their job, their livelihood, their health and wellness, that falls under the wellness economy.
And do we know how much that economy is worth?
There's lots of projections and it changes every single day. But as per Forbes in 2019, they did project that by the end of 2022, it would be worth more than $77 billion.
That's a lot of money. Rebecca, who does this leave behind?
Going back to what Robin had touched on earlier, and that whole entire piece around reclaiming practices that are indigenous or practices that come and stem from racialized communities. For the most part, when we think about wellness, I don't know about you, Nam, but for a very long time, I was the only person of color, the only Black woman in my yoga practices and in yoga studios and spaces and a lot of wellness spaces beyond just yoga. And so for me, when I look at it, it's typically and historically racialized people and other people who occupy spaces of marginality that are excluded from wellness spaces as well as wellness practices. So it's not just the actual space, but then the idea of being able to see themselves reflected back in practice too as well, which doesn't necessarily mean you have to be in a physical space to be able to embody that. But what ends up happening is that people also then are just excluded from all practices and all facets of what that wellness, all facets of what wellness looks like and can be, or how it's processed at an individual and a collective community level too as well.
Rebecca, you mentioned that you would be taking yoga classes and you were the only person that looked like you. Did you feel like you didn't belong, or did you feel, were you not welcomed by the people in that space?
For a very long time, I was the only woman of color, the only Black person. I've been practicing yoga for 20 years, over 20 years. And for a large part of that time, that's just how I was felt. I was felt like I wasn't welcomed. I've, been in spaces where people have, I've come into the space and people have moved their mats.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.